Imagine this. You wake before dawn in a house devoid of electricity, no humming refrigerator, no buzzing devices charging on nightstands, no distant traffic sounds filtering through windows. Just absence. Vast, expansive absence. The kind of silence our ancestors knew intimately, the silence that once defined human existence. Within seconds, something inside you begins to squirm. Your fingers twitch toward the phone that isn't there. Your mind, accustomed to constant stimulation, begins spinning faster, desperately seeking something, anything to consume. What terrifies you more, the silence itself or your visceral reaction to it? We have become a species allergic to quiet. The modern human exists in a perpetual state of input overwhelm, notifications blinking for attention, screens illuminating our faces at all hours, algorithms predicting our next desire before we've finished savoring the current one. The average person now consumes more information in a single day than someone in the 17th century might have encountered in their entire lifetime. Yet, paradoxically, the more we consume, the more malnourished our minds become. Consider this contradiction. We have unlimited access to knowledge, yet diminishing wisdom. Infinite connectivity, yet epidemic loneliness. Constant entertainment, yet pervasive boredom. Could it be that in our desperate flight from silence, we've lost something fundamental to our humanity? The noise doesn't just exist externally, it reverberates inside your skull. The endless internal monologue, the replaying of conversations, the anxiety about tomorrow's meeting, the background hum of undefined dread. Your thoughts themselves have become noise, a chaotic symphony without resolution or purpose. When was the last time you experienced a thought that wasn't reactive, wasn't triggered by external stimuli, wasn't immediately shared or validated by others? What if the greatest threat to your cognitive liberty isn't censorship, but voluntary self-distraction? Neuroscientists have begun documenting a disturbing phenomenon. Our brains are physically changing in response to our information environment. Attention spans collapse, memory centers atrophy, and the neural pathways that once allowed for deep contemplation grow weaker from disuse. We're evolving backward, becoming hyper-vigilant, perpetually distracted versions of ourselves, increasingly incapable of the sustained attention that defined our greatest human achievements. Yet, when forced into silence, during power outages, wilderness retreats, or medical quarantines, many report a strange experience. First comes the withdrawal, the restlessness, irritability, even panic. But then something shifts. Like eyes adjusting to darkness, the mind begins to perceive what was previously invisible. Thoughts slow and deepen, connections form, ideas germinate not from external consumption, but from internal cultivation. What might you discover if you allowed the noise to subside long enough to hear what lies beneath it? There exists a growing suspicion among philosophers, psychologists, and spiritual teachers alike that our addiction to noise serves a darker purpose than mere entertainment or connection. Perhaps the constant barrage shields us from confronting uncomfortable truths about ourselves, our choices, our fragility, our mortality. Perhaps silence is threatening precisely because it strips away the distractions that keep existential anxiety at bay. When you can no longer drown out the questions that haunt the human condition, who am I beyond my social roles? What gives my existence meaning? What will remain of me when I'm gone? You must finally face them. And facing them requires courage few have cultivated in an age of endless escape routes. The ancient Stoics practiced memento mori, the contemplation of death, not out of morbidity, but because they understood that confronting our temporal nature clarifies what truly matters. Today we practice memento nulla, the contemplation of nothing, scrolling mindlessly to avoid the whispers of our deeper selves. What if the noise isn't enhancing your life, but diminishing it? What if, in your desperate bid to remain connected, informed, and entertained, you've disconnected from the most vital resource of all, the unfathomable depths of your own consciousness? The question isn't whether you consume noise. We all do. The question is, what happens in its absence? What neural mechanisms activate? What dormant capacities awaken? What forbidden insights emerge when you finally allow yourself to experience the world unmediated, unfiltered, undistracted? The answer lies beyond this page, beyond these words. It awaits in the spaces between heartbeats, in the moments before sleep claims you, in the courage to put down the screen and face the void that terrifies and tantalizes in equal measure. But first, we must understand why this void exists at all, and the powerful forces that work tirelessly to ensure you never experience it. The noise that surrounds you is not accidental. It is cultivated, engineered, and perfected. But to understand why requires excavating deeper than you might be comfortable going. Friedrich Nietzsche warned over a century ago that when you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you. He recognized that confronting emptiness, both external and internal, forces uncomfortable reckonings. What he couldn't have anticipated was how sophisticated our abyss avoidance mechanisms would become. Today's noise isn't merely a distraction, it's an elaborate defense system against the fundamental anxieties of existence. Consider how your relationship with silence has evolved. As a child, you likely experienced moments of pure absorption, watching ants march across sidewalks, clouds morphing overhead, dust particles dancing in sunbeams. No commentary needed, no validation sought, no urgent need to capture or share the experience. Just pure, unmediated presence. When did that capacity begin to atrophy? When did unstructured time become something to fear rather than savor? The Industrial Revolution mechanized human existence, dividing time into productive units. The digital revolution accelerated this process exponentially, transforming even our leisure into commodified, optimized experiences. The spaces between stimuli, the cognitive breathing room that once allowed for integration, reflection, and meaning-making, have been systematically eliminated. As Arthur Schopenhauer observed, noise is a torture to all intellectual people, precisely because it prevents the deep thinking that gives life substance and direction. Your brain has been hijacked by what psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi called psychic entropy, the state of inner disorder created when information overwhelms consciousness. Every notification, headline, and image you consume demands cognitive resources. Even when ignored, these stimuli tax your limited attention. The average person checks their phone 96 times daily, once every 10 minutes of waking life. Each check fragments consciousness, preventing the sustained attention required for what Carl Jung called individuation, the process by which you become fully yourself. This fragmentation isn't merely inconvenient, it's existential. Aldous Huxley, in his prophetic Brave New World, didn't envision totalitarianism arriving through overt oppression, but through pleasure, a society so saturated with entertainment that no one would notice their deeper capacities withering away. People will come to love their oppression, he warned, to adore the technologies that undo their capacities to think. Sound familiar? The consequences extend beyond the individual. Sociologist Zygmunt Bauman described modern existence as liquid, characterized by impermanence, uncertainty, and constant change. In this liquid world, sustained attention becomes nearly impossible. Democracy itself depends on citizens capable of processing complex information, detecting manipulation, and engaging in reasoned debate. Yet the very neural pathways required for these functions are precisely those most compromised by constant noise consumption. Viktor Frankl, having survived the concentration camps, noted that between stimulus and response lies a space where freedom and growth become possible. That space is systematically shrinking in your consciousness. The result is a life increasingly reactive rather than creative, consumed rather than contemplative, borrowed rather than authentic. What you're experiencing isn't merely distraction, it's what philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre might have called bad faith. You're complicit in your own cognitive colonization, surrendering your autonomy in exchange for the comfort of never facing yourself fully. Each reach for the phone in a moment of discomfort, each hour surrendered to algorithmic recommendations, each social media check during a conversation. These are small betrayals of your potential, microscopic surrenders of sovereignty. The bitter irony. This surrender doesn't even deliver what it promises. Psychologist Jonathan Haidt has documented skyrocketing rates of anxiety, depression, and suicide corresponding directly with smartphone adoption and social media use. The noise promises connection, but delivers isolation. Promises information, but delivers confusion. Promises convenience, but delivers dependency. Your brain, that miraculous product of millions of years of evolution, developed in environments of natural rhythms, meaningful silences, and information scarcity. It evolved to notice changes against backgrounds of constancy, to derive meaning from patterns, to process experiences during periods of calm. Now it exists in permanent fight or flight, bathed in cortisol and adrenaline, perpetually scanning horizons for the next dopamine hit. The default mode network, the brain system active when you're not focused on external tasks, is where self-reflection, moral reasoning, and creative insight happen. This is where you consolidate experience into wisdom, where you integrate disparate knowledge into coherent worldviews, where you connect with your deepest values and aspirations. This system requires silence to function. Each minute spent consuming noise is a minute denied to this essential human work. This is the hidden mechanism behind what philosopher Martin Heidegger called forgetfulness of being. The tendency to become so absorbed in surface-level concerns that you lose touch with deeper questions of meaning and purpose. The noise doesn't just fill your ears or eyes, it occupies the cognitive space where existential contemplation might otherwise occur. The philosopher Blaise Pascal observed that all of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. His insight has never been more relevant. Your discomfort with silence isn't natural, it's cultivated. Your addiction to stimulation isn't inevitable, it's engineered. Your surrender to distraction isn't freedom, it's capitulation to forces that profit from your diminished capacity for independent thought. What makes this problem so insidious is that, unlike obvious threats, it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive as a villain, but as a friend, promising relief, connection, and ease. It doesn't steal your attention in dramatic heists, but in thousands of tiny transactions you barely notice. And unlike external oppressors that can be fought, this one lives inside your own reflexive behaviors, your own cultivated preferences, your own neural pathways, carved by repetition. The true cost of this constant noise cannot be calculated because how do you measure the insights never reached, the creative works never produced, the relationships never deepened, the self-knowledge never attained? How do you quantify the absence of wisdom? But the consequences of this cognitive condition extend far beyond the personal realm into territories you might not have considered, territories with implications not just for your well-being, but for your very autonomy. The effects of perpetual noise extend far beyond momentary distraction. They reshape your neural architecture, your perception of reality, and ultimately, your capacity for humanity itself. Consider the phenomenon neuroscientists call attentional residue. When you switch between tasks from email to social media to conversation to work, your attention doesn't fully transfer. It leaves traces behind, cognitive remnants that accumulate throughout your day. By evening, your mind resembles not a clear pond, but a murky swamp of unprocessed stimuli. This isn't merely inefficiency, it's cognitive pollution. Studies show that merely having your phone visible Not using it, just seeing it, reduces your available cognitive capacity by up to 10%. The device silently whispers to your subconscious, "Check me," demanding resources you don't consciously notice depleting. This attentional fragmenting creates what psychologists call continuous partials attention, a state where you're never fully present anywhere. You exist perpetually in the shallows of experience, skimming across surfaces, but never diving deep. The average adult now has an attention span of approximately 8 seconds, 1 second less than a goldfish. This isn't hyperbole, it's measurable. Neurological reality, but the consequences run deeper still. Your brain's plasticity, its ability to reorganize itself based on experience, works both ways. The neural pathways you use strengthen, those you neglect weaken. When you consume noise constantly, you literally reshape your brain to prefer distraction over focus, novelty over depth, reaction over reflection. MRI studies reveal that heavy internet users show significant changes in white matter, the brain tissue responsible for communication between regions. The prefrontal cortex, the seat of executive function, impulse control, and complex decision-making, physically shrinks. You are, neurologically speaking, becoming someone else. This transformation manifests in subtle but profound ways. You find yourself increasingly impatient with long-form content. Books that once captivated you now feel tedious. Conversations without digital augmentation seem somehow lacking. Silence feels not peaceful but threatening. You recognize this. Change, but rationalize it as adaptation to modern life rather than what it truly is. Cognitive diminishment. The noise doesn't just change how you think, it changes what you think about. Consider the availability heuristic identified by psychologists Kahneman and Tversky. This cognitive bias causes you to judge the likelihood of events based on how easily examples come to mind. In a noise-saturated environment, what comes easily to mind? Not the slow-moving existential challenges of our time, but the sensational, the outrageous, the immediate. Your threat detection system, evolved for physical dangers, now triggers constantly for symbolic ones, political opponents, cultural changes, status anxieties. Meanwhile, the attention economy has perfected what behavioral psychologist B.F. Skinner discovered with his operant conditioning chambers. Variable reward schedules where rewards come at unpredictable intervals create the strongest behavioral reinforcement. Every notification, every refresh, every new content feed operates on this principle. You've been conditioned more effectively than Pavlov's dogs, trained to respond to digital stimuli with such reliability that the average person touches their phone 2,717 times daily. This conditioning extends to emotion regulation. When uncomfortable feelings arise, boredom, anxiety, loneliness, uncertainty, the reflex to escape into noise becomes automatic. Each time you reach for distraction instead of sitting with discomfort, you weaken your emotional resilience. The capacity to tolerate difficult feelings, what psychologists call distress tolerance, atrophies like an unused muscle. You become increasingly vulnerable to manipulation by any entity that promises relief from the discomfort of being fully present. Consider the disquieting research on empathy. Since 2000, empathy levels among American college students have dropped by 40%. This decline correlates directly with increased screen time and decreased face-to-face interaction. The brain's mirror neuron system, which allows you to understand others' experiences, requires direct human contact to develop properly. No emoji, no matter how expressive, can replace the subtle micro-expressions that build your capacity for compassion. The societal implications are equally alarming. Political discourse increasingly resembles what philosopher Herbert Marcuse called one-dimensional thought, communication stripped of nuance, context, and depth. Complex ideas cannot survive in environments optimized for 280 characters or 60-second videos. Democracy itself depends on what philosopher Hannah Arendt called enlarged thinking, the capacity to consider multiple perspectives and recognize common humanity across differences. This capacity diminishes in noise-saturated environments, designed to amplify outrage and certainty rather than curiosity and humility. Even your sense of self becomes compromised. Philosopher Charles Taylor described modern identity as increasingly dialogical, formed through recognition from others. In digital spaces, this mutates into what sociologists call the quantified self, identity reduced to metrics, likes, followers, shares. Your internal reference point shifts from intrinsic values to external validation. The question, "Who am I?" becomes inseparable from "How am I perceived?" This is not merely narcissism, it's existential displacement, the self relocated from within to without. The most disturbing consequence may be what philosopher Byung-Chul Han calls the burnout society. Unlike previous eras where exploitation came from external forces, today you willingly exploit yourself. You internalize the demands of productivity, optimization, and connectivity until they become indistinguishable from your own desires. You become both master and slave, oppressor and oppressed, in a system that commodifies your attention while convincing you this arrangement represents freedom. This self-exploitation manifests physically. Cortisol, the stress hormone, remains chronically elevated in noise consumers. Your autonomic nervous system, designed for occasional activation during genuine threats, remains stuck in sympathetic dominance. Sleep quality deteriorates, inflammation increases. The biological mechanisms that maintained health for millennia break down under conditions they were never designed to withstand. Perhaps most alarming is what researchers call cognitive offloading, the increasing tendency to store information externally rather than in memory. Studies show that when people expect information to be available digitally, they make less effort to remember it. This isn't merely convenience, it's cognitive outsourcing. Your memory, once the foundation of personal identity and wisdom, increasingly resides in devices rather than neural networks. You become, in essence, dependent on external systems for access to your own experience. What remains unspoken in these transactions is the power dynamic. Those who control information flows, the attention merchants, data brokers, and algorithm designers, gain unprecedented influence over collective consciousness. They shape not just what you think about, but how you think, not just what you desire, but how you desire. This isn't conspiracy, it's business model. The ultimate unseen consequence is the most devastating, the erosion of meaning itself. Philosopher Simone Weil observed that attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. Without the capacity for sustained attention, experiences flatten. Beauty becomes mere prettiness. Love becomes mere attraction. Purpose becomes mere activity. The depth dimension of existence, the very thing that makes human life worth living, gradually disappears from view. But if this is our condition, is there any path toward recovery? Can a mind shaped by noise learn to hear something else? There exists a radical possibility that few dare consider. What if the noise isn't something that happens to you, but something you unconsciously choose? What if silence isn't something you find, but something you create? This shift in perspective, from passive victim to active participant, changes everything. The path forward begins not with adding new habits, but with subtraction. The Japanese concept of mai, the meaningful space between things, offers a counterintuitive wisdom. Emptiness creates possibility. The sculptor doesn't add clay to create a masterpiece. She removes everything that isn't the sculpture. Similarly, cognitive liberation comes not through acquisition, but through careful, intentional removal. Consider Benjamin Franklin's observation: all humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. The revolutionary act isn't finding the perfect productivity system or digital detox program. It's reclaiming the courage to face yourself in silence. This requires understanding that your aversion to stillness isn't weakness, but conditioning, not personal failing, but predictable neurological response to designed manipulation. Throughout history, those who changed the world often did so through deliberate withdrawal from noise. Einstein's theory of relativity emerged during long walks. Darwin's insights crystallized in solitary reflection. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote his most powerful speeches in isolated cabins. Newton discovered gravity during a plague quarantine that forced solitude upon him. The creative breakthroughs that define human progress almost invariably emerge not from constant stimulation, but from its absence. More recently, some of our most innovative thinkers have rebelled against noise culture. Digital pioneer Bill Gates takes think weeks in isolated cabins with no technology. Author Cal Newport practices digital minimalism, using technology only for clearly defined values rather than default distraction. Artist Jenny Odell writes about the radical right to refuse, to reject the attention economy's constant demands. These aren't Luddites, but sophisticated users who understand what's at stake: cognitive autonomy itself. The rebellion begins with a simple but profound recognition. Attention is not just a resource, but the foundation of conscious experience. Where your attention goes, your life follows. Yet you've surrendered control over this precious capacity to systems designed to monetize it. The average person spends over 4 hours daily on their smartphone. That's 60 full days annually, more than 10 years in a lifetime. Imagine what could be created, discovered, or experienced in those reclaimed years. The practical path toward cognitive liberation involves several counterintuitive steps. First, create inviolable boundaries, temporal territories where noise cannot enter. This begins small, perhaps just 15 minutes daily without digital input. During these periods, you'll experience what psychologists call withdrawal symptoms: restlessness, anxiety, even panic. These discomforts aren't signs of failure, but evidence of how deeply the dependency runs. They are necessary passages toward cognitive freedom. Second, practice active attention rather than passive consumption. When you read deeply. 1. Article fully absorbed rather than dozens skimmed. When you converse, listen completely, without the half attention that characterizes most interactions. When you experience emotion, feel it fully, without reaching for the digital pacifier. This isn't merely concentration, but presence, the capacity to be fully where you are. Third, reclaim physical space. Create environments that discourage distraction. The cognitive scientist Donald Norman coined the term affordances to describe how physical designs suggest certain uses. Your environment contains countless affordances for distraction: the visible phone, the accessible tablet, the omnipresent screens. Redesign your spaces to afford contemplation instead. Make distraction require effort rather than being the path of least resistance. Fourth, cultivate what philosopher Josef Pieper called receptive awareness, the capacity to receive reality without immediately categorizing, judging, or using it. This state, similar to what Eastern traditions call mindfulness, allows experience to penetrate below the surface level of consciousness. When you encounter beauty, don't immediately photograph it, absorb it. When you have an insight, don't immediately share it, develop it. When you face a problem, don't immediately Google it, contemplate it. Fifth, practice strategic technological integration rather than reflexive adoption. For every new technology, ask, what human capacity does this strengthen, and what capacity might it diminish? What values does it serve, and what values might it undermine? These aren't abstract questions, but practical evaluations of cognitive cost-benefit. Some technologies deserve wholesale rejection, others require careful boundaries. Still others merit enthusiastic embrace. The key is conscious choice rather than passive acceptance. The neuroscientist Michael Merzenich discovered that even profoundly habituated neural pathways can change, what we now call neuroplasticity. Your brain's current state isn't destiny, but merely its current adaptation to environmental demands. Change those demands and your neural architecture will follow. Former noise addicts report something remarkable. After the withdrawal period, a new sensitivity emerges, thoughts become clearer, sensory experiences intensify, emotions gain depth and nuance. The world becomes more vivid, not despite the absence of constant stimulation, but because of it. This isn't romanticized technophobia. The goal isn't Stone Age existence, but intentional integration, using technology as a tool for human flourishing, rather than allowing it to use you. As philosopher Martin Heidegger noted, the essence of technology isn't technological, but human. It reveals our relationship to being itself. When you reclaim agency over attention, you reclaim authority over your own consciousness. The most radical aspect of this rebellion is its accessibility. Unlike political revolutions requiring collective action, cognitive liberation begins with individual choice. No one can prevent you from reclaiming attentional sovereignty. No permission is needed. No special resources required. The power to begin exists entirely within your next decision about where to direct your attention. What makes this revolution so threatening to existing power structures is precisely its simplicity. If enough people reclaimed their cognitive autonomy, entire business models would collapse. Industries dependent on attentional capture would face existential crisis. The rebellion isn't loud but quiet, not destructive, but creative. It threatens, not through opposition, but through disengagement from systems that require participation to survive. But beyond practical techniques and systemic implications lies something even more profound, a fundamental truth about human consciousness that noise has obscured from view, a truth whose rediscovery might change everything. What awaits beyond the noise is more radical than improved productivity, sharper thinking, or even greater peace. Though these emerge naturally, the ultimate revelation is both simpler and more profound. You are not who you think you are. The identity you've constructed, the narrative self, the autobiographical character at the center of your life story, exists primarily in language, in internal chatter, in the ceaseless commentary that noise culture amplifies and validates. When this commentary finally quiets, something extraordinary happens. You discover presence beneath personality, awareness beneath identity, being beneath doing. Neuroscientists studying advanced meditators, those who have trained their attention through thousands of hours of practice, observe a fascinating phenomenon. The default mode network, the brain system active during self-referential thinking, temporarily deactivates during deep states of presence. Simultaneously, the experienced boundaries between self and world become permeable. Subjects report not the absence of consciousness, but its expansion, awareness, without the constriction of the familiar I. This isn't mystical speculation, but observable neural reality. Your normal waking consciousness, what philosopher Alan Watts called the skin-encapsulated ego, is just one configuration of awareness, not its fundamental nature. The noise hasn't merely distracted you. It has maintained a particular self-construct that dissolves when attention is fully liberated. Consider the profound implications. The anxieties that haunt you, achievement anxiety, status anxiety, existential anxiety, depend entirely on maintaining a particular self-concept separate from and threatened by the world. When this construct temporarily dissolves, so do its associated fears. What emerges isn't escape, but clarity. The recognition that you've been fighting battles that exist only in conceptual reality, not in direct experience. Philosopher Thomas Metzinger describes human consciousness as a transparent self-model. You don't experience the model as a model, but as reality itself. The noise ensures this model remains unquestioned by keeping attention perpetually directed outward or absorbed in internal dialogue that reinforces familiar identity patterns. In silence, the model becomes visible as a model, a useful but limited representation rather than ultimate reality. This explains why noise addiction runs so deep. It's not merely habit, but existential defense mechanism. The noise protects you from what Zen practitioners call the great doubt, the vertigo that arises when fixed identity momentarily suspends. This isn't comfortable. It's why physicist Richard Feynman observed, "I can live with doubt and uncertainty. I think it's much more interesting to live not knowing than to have answers which might be wrong." Those who have experienced sustained periods without noise, whether through deliberate practice or accidental circumstance, report a common sequence. First comes withdrawal, then restlessness, then boredom, then anxiety, and finally, if one persists, a falling away of something previously thought essential. What falls away isn't consciousness, but its constriction, not awareness, but its habitual objects. What remains has been called many names across traditions: presence, being, awareness, witnessing consciousness. This state isn't transcendent escape, but radical intimacy with what is. Colors appear more vivid, sensations intensify, emotions move. Through awareness without solidifying into identity, thoughts arise and dissolve like clouds in the sky, rather than defining the weather of consciousness. You discover that you can observe your thinking rather than being your thinking, a simple but revolutionary shift in perspective. The noise hasn't merely distracted you from tasks, but from your fundamental nature. You've been like someone so, absorbed in movies that they've forgotten the screen they're projected upon. The constant stimulation hasn't just filled your time, but constructed your sense of self. In its absence, you don't disappear, you expand. This expansion has profound practical implications. Creative insights emerge not from effortful thinking, but from the spaces between thoughts. Empathy deepens when you're not constantly reinforcing the boundaries of separate selfhood. Suffering transforms when you can witness painful experiences without complete identification. Even death anxiety, perhaps humanity's fundamental fear, shifts when you've glimpsed awareness that doesn't depend on biographical continuity. Throughout history, philosophers, poets, and contemplatives have pointed to this realization. Rumi wrote, "Silence is the language of God, all else is poor translation." Meister Eckhart described it as the still point within the turning world. Einstein noted that his greatest insights came not from calculation, but from what he called combinatory play, in states of open awareness. These weren't metaphorical flourishes, but attempts to articulate direct experience available to anyone willing to endure the discomfort of noise withdrawal. The final and most liberating truth is this: the peace you've sought through endless consumption, achievement, and distraction has always been present beneath the search itself. Not as something to attain, but as the ground of experience, accessible not through addition, but subtraction, not through acquisition, but surrender. This isn't spiritual bypassing or escapism, quite the opposite. It allows more complete engagement with reality, undistorted by compulsive thinking or reactive patterns. The scientists, artists, and leaders who've changed our world have invariably touched this state, whether they named it or not. Their breakthroughs came not from frenetic activity, but from moments when the noise subsided enough for deeper currents of consciousness to emerge. As you stand at this threshold, you face a decision both simple and profound. Will you continue allowing your consciousness, your one wild and precious life, to be shaped primarily by systems designed to capture and monetize attention? Or will you reclaim the sovereignty that has always been your birthright? The noise will remain available. The world will continue its machinations. But something fundamental changes when you've glimpsed what lies beyond the ceaseless stimulation. You can no longer be fully convinced by the hypnotic spell that once defined your reality. Perhaps true freedom isn't the ability to choose between endless options of consumption, but the capacity to hear the silence beneath the noise, to feel the stillness within motion, to recognize vastness behind the particular. Perhaps wisdom isn't accumulating more information, but seeing through the illusion that information alone can satisfy the deepest human longing, the longing not for distraction from existence, but for complete immersion in its mystery. The invitation stands: close this screen, set aside all devices, find a quiet place, sit with the initial discomfort until it transforms into something else entirely. Discover what your unique consciousness reveals when the noise finally subsides. The journey requires no special technique, only the courage to remain present as the constructed self temporarily dissolves into awareness itself. What awaits isn't escape, but homecoming, not transcendence, but intimacy with existence exactly as it is. The noise has never been the enemy, only a temporary forgetting of what you already are. The silence is waiting,